Hello all. My name is Corinne Donley, and this is Foundations of Academic Writing. Welcome. This is an ongoing series in the Foundations of Academic Writing, specifically designed for students in the Bachelor Completion Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Though it's possible that it's applicable to more than just the students in the BAC. But each week we've been tackling a different aspect of writing. And in the early weeks, we started with critical reading and some broader concepts like structuring a paper or developing a thesis or reorganizing paragraphs. And then we got more and more specific as we went to topics like transitions and improving the flow and the lexical cohesion of a sentence. Then we did a weird hop back last week to research strategies because it seemed to time up with some assignments that students were doing. And this week, which is the second to last week of this workshop series, we're going to go back to the flow we were following earlier and start talking about revision strategies. So once you've got a solid first draft of the paper going, ways that you can revise it, turn it into a more polished product. Okay, so that's today's workshop, revision strategies. And as always, we will kick off with some timed writing just to help you arrive wherever you're at in your own home or school building or what have you. So as always, I'm watching the clock, and I'd like you to take 1 minute to free write on the prompt. When you first sit down to write a paper, how do you get started? So when you first sit down to write a paper, this isn't revision yet, how do you start? Okay, 1 minute, go. Okay, that's a minute. Next minute. Okay, so what does the revision process typically look like for you? So once you've started revising, what does that usually look like? 1 minute, go. Okay, that's the next minute. Last minute. How do you know when you're done revising? So how can you tell when you're finished with the paper? 1 minute. Okay, and that is the last minute. Great. So as usual, I am gonna weave my own responses in as we go through this workshop. So I'm not gonna give them to you just right now, but actually what I would like to start with is drawing some distinctions between these three terms. So revising, editing, and proofreading. So because today we're focusing specifically on revising, but I think often when people think of revising, they'll sort of use interchangeably the words proofreading and editing. So with that in mind, let's start the trusty screen share. The document that I'm going to pull up is just a little web page with some descriptions of these three different terms: revision, editing, and proofreading. So, okay, the screen share should have begun now. And in case it's at all blurry for you, I'm going to try to read through it. Okay. So revision. So revision means revisioning your paper. It is big picture work. Step back and ask yourself, does the paper you wrote respond directly to the assignment and its audience? Answer the questions that were posed. Is the argument clear? Is it sufficiently complex? Check to see if any of the ideas need to be developed, and if you've articulated the relationships among ideas. See if you need to add further evidence or support. Revision can require adding material, taking material away, working with the big strokes of the paper. It might involve changing the order of paragraphs and recrafting topic sentences / transitions. It may demand redrafting the introduction and checking the conclusions to see what should be brought up to the front of the paper. All of this is when you revision your paper. Okay, so key themes there. Revisioning, right? Rethinking the paper on the large scale. So really checking to see if the argument is being properly supported and communicating. So then by contrast, you've got editing. I'm going to read that. People often refer to all stages of revision as editing, but editing is what you do after you revise. Editing involves crafting with a fine tool, and it leads to style and coherence. Here's where you consider your paper as a writer or artist. Try reading your paper aloud, slowly, in parts. Is the voice clear and confident? Is there a sense of rhythm and flow in each paragraph, each sentence? Do the sentences connect up with one another like well-constructed joints? Editing is when you correct any awkwardness that may have occurred in the initial drafting or in revision. Revision can be very helpful to the big picture, but create problems within paragraphs, for example. So while editing is a good time to check the clarity of your title and the accuracy of your reference or works cited pages, while editing is a good time to do that. Careful editing is critical to a polished, well-written paper. Okay? So what they're stressing there is the editing has a lot more to do with word choice and sentence level stuff, and making sure that the paper sounds the way that you would like for it to sound. I think some of those things can be included within the revision process personally, and we're going to get to that as we move through. But the idea is that I'm going to support the overall idea of this paragraph that you're working with more of a fine comb and working in more detail when you're editing. That's no longer the big picture. Okay, and then finally there's proofreading. So proofreading comes last and consists of a final sweep through your paper with an eye for errors. When proofreading, you make your final check for errors in sentence structure, grammar, verb tense, and punctuation. You also look for mistakes in spelling, use of quotations, citation details, etc. Look not just for the tricky mistakes, but also for any typos. It is important to check that your name is on your essay, and it is desirable to number your pages or include a word count. This is the final read-through of your paper, your last chance to impress your reader and show your commitment to your work. Reading aloud at this stage or any other stage of the revision process can help you focus more carefully on your work. Okay, so pretty simple distinctions there, but the idea being that those are the phases toward completion that you move through. So revision, thinking through the big stuff, editing, thinking about how to shape the micro stuff, and then finally proofreading, which is giving it one last look over before you turn it in to make sure that everything is as it should be. That final point about being sure that you read aloud, I think is kind of a key one, and that's going to come up a little bit today also. But having just gone over that, let's say with this idea that revisioning or revising the paper involves thinking through these big picture items, I'd like to sort of set up a process for revising the paper that follows the same process that this whole workshop series, the arc of it, has traveled. So first, before we got down to the sentence level stuff like transitions and ways to make sentences connect effectively and cohesion and those kinds of things. Before we got there, we spent many weeks talking about how best to develop an argument and how best to incorporate sources and what analysis really looks like. And I maintain, as I have all these weeks, that those are really the central things to get in place first in a paper, because that's where your idea is truly communicated in how you assemble sources toward whatever point you're trying to make. And if that's not solid, no amount of crafting the language or making it sound good is going to do that work, right? So it's key to start with those things, which are called, in the composition studies jargon of it, higher order concerns. Because if you start with the lower order concerns of polishing sentences, right, you might find that you have to repolish and repolish and repolish each time, because as you're moving around big chunks and figuring out how to better say your argument, you're likely cutting a lot of material or adding a lot of new material. And if you work in detail in the nitty-gritty each time, you're just causing yourself that much work. So as much as possible, when you're approaching the revision process, if you can revise in layers, as it were, and go for the ideas and the idea development before you go for the sound of the thing, then you probably save yourself some work in the long run. I'd also like to say about the revision process, before we get into specific techniques you can use to approach it, that it's, in a sense, like applying critical reading to your own writing. So we've been developing throughout this workshop the skills of critical reading. So asking those questions about the piece that you're reading, like who is the speaker, to whom are they speaking, how are they trying to change their audience, what evidence are they selecting to do that, is it effective, is it ineffective, right? Well, you actually ask those same questions of your own piece of writing when you're revising it. Who was I trying to communicate to with this? How did I want to change them? What is likely to be effective in changing them? Have I done that? Is this going to be convincing to them? Is it not? So this is the sort of internal dialogue that that takes place. Maybe not even internal. Maybe it happens on the page. That would seem a solid approach too, a solid way of going about this. So with all that kind of introductory stuff being said, here are my suggestions, cobbled together from a number of sources, on how to approach the revision process, moving, as we've discussed, from the higher order concerns to the lower order concerns. So in the first place, I think it's really important to get some space from your document. So you've been working really hard on it. A lot of people I work with describe feeling totally lost, like they get sucked into their paper and can no longer tell what they were going for. They don't have enough distance anymore to see if it's working or not, or they stop being able to see typos even because they're just so in the paper. And I think that's super common, and that's great, honestly, to get so lost in it. But with that in mind, it's really a good idea to approach your paper with fresh eyes. So if you have the time to do it and you can take a day or two before you look at it again, that's a great idea. If you don't have that much time and you can take a couple hours, that's good. If you don't even have a couple hours, it might be a good idea to just switch up your activity a little bit. So if you've been writing the paper, before you switch immediately into revising it, consider taking a walk or cleaning your room or doing dishes or switching into a more like physical way of being. So it's not just you and your screen or you and your pad of paper. With that in mind, it's also a good idea, or a lot of people find it effective when they do return to the paper, to print it out so that it's not so, just not the same experience as it has been looking at your screen. And you can make notes physically on the document, and you can work with different colors and highlight and make it, again, more of like an experiential experience. So that's one idea. I also think it's nice when you are reapproaching your paper after some time away to remind yourself of what's most important to you, or why the paper exists at all. Why did you write it in the first place? So this is the question of who you're trying to change with your writing. But I think if you can keep that sort of level of focus, like when in all stages of the writing paper, but I'm doing this because, then it can sort of like motivate you to do the work. And because revising in so many senses is about being as clear as you possibly can in communicating the idea. If that idea is tremendously important to you, then you're going to desire to be clear and to really get your point across all the more. Okay. So then, as we were discussing mere moments ago with reading on different levels, I would suggest being really directed or really strategic about how you approach your each time. So I would suggest the first time through, read for your assignment. So has the paper done everything your teacher has asked you to do with it? If your teacher said have 10 sources, do you have at least 10 sources? If your teacher asked you to put 2 different fields in dialogue, have you done that? Have you properly represented both? I think one of the #1 mistakes with papers is that students get so excited about where their own research goes or their own thinking that they sort of like lose the tether of the prompt and end up writing on something that's not what the teacher was asking for, which you're perfectly entitled to do as a student. It just might compromise your grade a little bit, and so it's just some risk assessment to be done. But if you're trying to complete the assignment as was requested of you, good idea to note if you've actually done so. So in your first pass through of the paper. Next, I would suggest looking at your thesis statement. Again, is it identifiable in the document? Could someone else point to it as being the argument of this paper? It's probably a good thing if they can, because as we've discussed, the thesis is sort of like the contract with the reader. So once they know what to expect in your paper, they're gonna read for that, and they're gonna see if you have indeed proven what you said you were gonna prove. So best to make the thesis identifiable, and then to check in when you're in this revision stage. Do you still agree with it? Oftentimes, when doing research, your thesis statement is going to shift a little bit because you're going to find some evidence that maybe doesn't support it entirely. So when you're first writing and you've got, you're first assembling your research, you've got your working thesis statement, and that the idea is that stays a little bit malleable, and as you're researching more, it shifts and stuff. But it's a good idea to check in once you've completed a draft and once you have all the evidence assembled to see if the thesis that you've written down still represents what your paper has ended up talking about. And if it hasn't, then it needs some tweaking. Another important question, is the thesis specific enough? If that in your paper you've actually ended up writing about something incredibly narrow, so you've, instead of like broadly the importance of spirituality, you find that you have actually spent the bulk of your paper and had your research prove that mindfulness practices are important, then you probably just want to say that in your thesis, because if you say spirituality, everyone's going to be looking for spirituality. But if you say mindfulness, then you've just narrowed the scope of your paper, and you've narrowed the sort of like contract you've made with the reader. So they're only really going to be looking for mindfulness. Okay, so check your thesis out. Do you still agree? Is it specific enough? Does it need to be tweaked in any particular way? And don't be afraid to tweak it. Next, I would suggest reading for your argument. And this is probably a really big one because it's the bulk of your paper. But it's back to the question of scope. So is your paper trying to take on too much, or like more than can ever possibly be proven? And if so, how might you refine what your paper is taking on? A little bit of that is the work of the thesis. And a little bit of that, if your thesis is specific enough, is making sure you're not supplying like way too much evidence or tangents that don't actually relate to the thesis. So, okay, so you can check it out in the body of the writing too. Also, have you addressed every aspect of your thesis? So if your thesis has promised several things, and this is kind of like that breaking down thesis statement stuff that we did early on, do you get to all of those promises in your paper? You don't want to change your thesis, then you probably need to add in more writing. Then there's, okay, do you have evidence enough to prove each of the aspects of your thesis? And not just do you have evidence, but is the evidence balanced? So if you have pages and pages and pages on one aspect of your thesis, right, and you only have a paragraph on the other, then it's probably going to be apparent to the reader that you don't have as much research to support that point. Now, one idea would be to name the fact that, you know, research hasn't been done in that area as much, or you haven't been able to find as much, and you know, that's the reason. But if there's ample material out there for you to read, it's probably going to be noticeable to the reader that the paper is sort of like imbalanced. So that's another thing to look for, the balance. And yeah, and then the other final thing to check out with the argument piece is analysis. So for each piece of evidence that you've brought up, are you sandwiching it? Are you commenting on the evidence and linking it back to your main idea, right? Are you interpreting it? Because remember, if you'll recall, the analysis section is where you really do the work of the paper. That's where you show up in the paper and how you interpret the sources that you're bringing in, the evidence. Okay, and then finally, when you're reading through, the next sort of sweep of the paper that I would suggest making is a read through for your purpose in writing. So, or for this piece of like audience and how the audience is likely to understand what you've written. So whatever writing strategies you've employed, like what pieces of evidence you've selected, how you've worked through those and structured them, are those going to be effective for the audience you're trying to reach? So, you know, in life, or, you know, when we're explaining a concept to people who aren't yet likely to be familiar with it, we usually define a term before we start widely using it, so that we're sure that we're on the same page with the person to whom we're trying to communicate, right? So with this in mind, it's good to kind of like think through the logic of the piece from your potential reader's perspective. So do they understand one term before you start building your argument on it? Is the order that you've chosen to present your material in going to be most compelling to this audience? Those are the kinds of things you can think about there. And is your language accessible to them? Now, some might say that language is more on the level of editing, and it's probably true that you don't want to get too focused in the first passes of the paper on word choice and all of that. By the same token, if you're trying to reach an audience of, I don't know, high schoolers, it may not be as effective to write a super jargony paper. This is kind of like the voice piece that we've talked about in previous sessions. Okay, so then, so we're going to call those, those strategies, reading for a different thing each time. So that would be one way to like go back when you're by yourself and approach your paper. Another way to go back and approach your paper and think about revision is not to do it alone. And this one I love because I'm a writing tutor. And so often my whole job is just reflecting back to someone else what I'm hearing and asking them questions about it, such that they can start to further develop their idea or see what's sort of missing from the paper. But a suggestion for how to approach the revision process is simply to find a friend, find someone who is interested in your ideas and your work, and ask them to help you. So there are a couple different ways of approaching this. One way is not to have your paper present at all, but to talk your friend through the argument that you're making. So tell your friend everything that your paper is about without even looking at your paper, see how much you can get of it, and then have your friend take notes while you're doing it on how you're describing stuff, or like what order you've presented the information in, so that, just like we said above, like you're likely when you're explaining something to someone to define a term before you start implementing it. Your friend can kind of like reflect back to you, well, first you built up this whole concept before you moved to this one that was important or helping me to understand. And then once you've got that sort of like list from them, you can go back to your own paper and see how much you followed that, and if you think what you've done on the paper makes more sense, or if maybe the way that you chose to explain it to your friend makes more sense. Okay, that's a good check. You can also have your friend ask you questions. So you can explain your argument, and they can tell you when they don't understand a thing, or when they don't think the argument has been fully developed enough. And their questions might very well be signs of places in the paper where the reader is likely to have questions. Okay, so that's one. Here's another friend strategy: to read your paper aloud to your friend. So a lot of people, this is not true for everyone, but are like auditory people, and are more likely to hear something that sounds off when they're reading aloud than when they're just looking at the paper and there isn't that sort of like rhythmic or auditory quality to it. So I would suggest reading the paper at a normal pace, and just taking note of any time you're kind of like pausing in your reading, either to explain something to your friend. So in the moments where you're like reading along and then you go like, well, what I didn't explain here is that blank, 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 or what, you know, like it's important to know that blank, blank, blank. And then you go back to reading the paper. Well, whatever occurred to you to say that would make the most sense to your friend is probably something that belongs in your paper and that would be really helpful to the reader. So for whatever reason in the writing of it, you didn't catch it, but in telling the, you know, you're like, you feel the need to support this particular point more, or to better explain it, and you do it verbally, but you haven't done it on the page. It's an easy sign, and one that I think I find myself doing unconsciously all the time. It's kind of a good like, oh, of course, yes, of course. By the same token, this can be a little bit more on the sentence level, but if you find yourself stumbling each time you read something, like it's a mouthful and you can't quite get it out, it could be a sign that the sentence itself needs some attention, or that it's too clunky. And the other thing you can do when you're reading is note any places that you have questions you'd like to ask your friend. So as you're reading and you're wondering if something's clear enough or not, make a little note on the paper, right? You've read the paper aloud. You go back and say, hey, I was wondering at this section, did this make sense? That kind of stuff. So really using your friends, your sort of like outside ear, as a resource, because hey, ultimately this paper will be read by someone else, so why not see what someone else thinks? Okay. Another little tactic, now we're off the friend suggestion, but is to do an outline without looking at your writing. So this is sort of like the solo version of talking your friend through your argument. But if you take your paper away altogether and see if you can do an outline of your argument and how you presented information, remembering how you introduced what, and then just look at it as it exists and see if that order makes sense to you. You can then go back and look at what you did right and see how closely the two follow. A different version of this is actually called the backwards outline and involves looking at the page itself and going through paragraph to paragraph and naming what each paragraph does, right, on a separate sheet of paper. So you're sort of just left with the skeleton of the paper. So this paragraph introduces the term mindfulness, right? This paragraph speaks about applications of it. This paragraph speaks about potential applications that haven't yet been applied or what have you, okay? And having sort of like named what each paragraph does, you can look at it on a fresh sheet of paper and ask yourself if the order follows, if it seems logical to if it might seem logical to the person trying to read it. And if not, you can reorder that, which in translating that to your actual document, it might mean cutting and pasting some paragraphs and moving those around. Which brings me to the next point, which is reorganizing paragraphs. So in the week when we talked about paragraph structure, something that we covered was that paragraphs should be like argument-driven rather than evidence-driven. So they should be source, or organized around the source. The paragraphs are actually organized around the point that you're trying to make, which is a part of or a support of your thesis. So paragraph reorganization can entail, well, any number of things, but going through each paragraph and asking yourself, how does this connect to my thesis? For each paragraph, how does thesis? And it should be pretty clear, especially in the analysis section of your paragraphs, what that has to do with the larger argument that you're making. And if it's not all that clear, that might be a place that you see that you need to do some refining. Another, for like the more visual revisers out there, another fun thing to do involves having markers or underlining or what have you, and reading through your paper and sort of checking out all the different topics that you cover in it. So like here I talk about my personal experience with mindfulness. Here I talk about the history of mindfulness. Here I talk about how mindfulness has been co-opted by corporate culture or what have you. And you can identify a different color for each of those different things and go through your paper in hard copy. And like each time you talk about your experience with it, that can be one color that you highlight. Each time you talk about corporate use of mindfulness, that can be another color that you highlight in. And if you find that you're like jumping between a lot of colors, so if it goes like pink, blue, green, green, pink, blue, pink, green, blue. Yeah, you get the idea. If it's hopping around, it might be a sign to you that you want to group like colors together. So maybe you want all your personal experience or the story you have to tell about how you got into mindfulness to not be woven throughout the story and to be its own section, just like you want your critique of the corporate use of mindfulness to be its own section. So if you've been like, if your paper kind of like jumps from topic to topic and you want them to be sectioned off, you can do that visually. So then once you've kind of identified those on your computer, it's a simple like cut and paste to group like ideas together in the paragraph. I find that one hugely helpful, especially for writers. So the first prompt that I asked you to address, right, was like how you typically approach a paper. And a lot of people just need to get all of their ideas out on paper first. So it's not like they're writing from an outline. And that's beautiful because once you have something out and you can work with it, but especially if you're one of those people, then you need to be really fearless about the revising process because it's likely that your ideas are a bit scattered and need to be kind of like regrouped, sort of like what an outline does. So if you, I mean, there's no right way to start a paper, but if you find that you do a lot of free writing into the approach of it, then really trying to figure out what the best order to present your ideas are and how to regroup those ideas, how to like sort them and reorganize them is going to be key to your revision process. So then when you're doing this paragraph reorganization also, once you've cut and pasted your different like topics into the same paragraphs and you've arranged them, then it's a really good idea to look at the topic sentences of each paragraph. So that's like the first sentence. And you should see if the topic sentence indeed names the content of that paper, because a topic sentence is like a mini thesis statement for the paragraph. So you want to see if what your topic sentence says the paragraph is going to do actually happens in the paragraph. Okay, so maybe that means you need to alter the content of the paragraph, or maybe you need to tweak the topic sentence if those two aren't in alignment. And then the kind of cool thing about this process of shifting around the content of paragraphs is that suddenly you no longer have to think about the like huge, overwhelming macro sense of the paper, but once you've grouped the like ideas together and you know that they all belong in that paragraph, and maybe they're like messy in there, but then you can really start reordering on the sentence level, saying, I'm going to like zoom in on just this paragraph and figure out how best to connect the sentences within it. Once that paragraph's good, great, and go on to the next paragraph, which is its own little unit and can be structured in its own little way, probably following that TTEB thing we talked about in the paragraph workshop, right? Transition, topic, evidence, brief wrap-up. Okay. So then finally, and I'm sorry, this is just such a lecture-y little workshop today, just different strategies for writing, for revising your writing. Finally, I'd like to suggest that you might approach the revision process by imagining yourself as different readers and thinking about the paper or reading it from the perspective of different readers. So this is a little bit more of an imaginative exercise, but for people that want to bring some play or some lightheartedness into their writing process, this is one that I would suggest. So me personally, when I need to get a little bit of distance from my writing, or I can't get out of my own head enough, I will sometimes change my outfit when I go back to read a paper, or put on a hat that's going to remind me of who I'm reading the paper as. It's going to help me not to slip into reading it as myself, where my like inner critic is likely to be super present. Just telling me I haven't done a good job or whatever, it doesn't sound right, but to totally like to put on a character and try to read it as someone else. And per this suggestion, I would suggest reading from at least two different perspectives. One perspective of your like imagined audience, who you most want to convince, right? And then also reading from the position of someone who is not your intended audience, who would be approaching this paper from a totally different field or would not be familiar with any of the terms, and asking questions from those perspectives. Another way to do it would be to read from a sympathetic point of view, so someone who's likely to be really convinced by your argument and is likely to be excited by it and agree with it, and then from the perspective of someone who is skeptical. Who is probably gonna be overly critical of things, ask a lot of questions of it. I'm a big fan of reading aloud, and I would suggest doing that here too. Might as well really take on the character and change the pitch of your voice, perhaps. So when you're reading from the perspective of the friendly reader, say, good thing to focus on is what's especially effective. And you can make notes on your paper from this perspective as you go. So as if this person were reading the text they found in a book and they were critically reading it and marking it up, right? What really works for this person? Like, where do they agree? And what do they find compelling? So what is well done about the paper from the perspective of this person? whatever position they're in. And how would they likely praise the paper? Maybe take the time to like praise out loud from this perspective what really works about it. All right. Alternately, when you're reading from the critic or the less friendly reader, right, and you're thinking about what this person, when I say position, I mean like what their job is, but maybe like if you're imagining your professor to be the critical one, I mean, maybe that won't be the case, but someone in academia who's likely to be especially critical or whatever, you might ask, read it and ask where they have questions. So someone who's really reading critically would need a constant like, well, what does this term mean? And this term has a lot of understandings, but what's the particular use of it here? And this isn't specific enough. And so reading from that perspective of like what needs to be clarified and further defined. The other thing that a critic is likely to have is evidence to the contrary. So this is actually a really, really key thing in approaching revision to your paper, but of thinking about where people are likely to disagree and or where you know there is evidence to the contrary that people could easily invoke. Okay, so if you're going to write a paper about climate change, you are probably aware that there is like a lot of debate on the validity of climate change as a topic. Well, scientifically, there might not be that much debate, but nevertheless, right, people want to make various arguments about why the temperature is changing on the planet or what have you. So in the book that I often reference, They Say, I Say, they talk about naming other perspectives on a topic as planting a naysayer. So acknowledging within your own writing that there are going to be different, nevertheless, you hold the argument that you do. So it's super helpful when you take on this critical role to ask questions or from this critical place to think through what kind of evidence your critic has to the contrary, right? So that you can either refute that evidence in your own writing before it even gets brought up, right? To say like, I know that people are going to argue this, but against that I would like to say. Or to acknowledge these other perspectives and to suggest that it doesn't, like even considering those, you still believe your own argument and why. Or, like fusing them in and showing why there isn't actually a contradiction there. But in any case, if you know of, or if you can think of any sort of arguments to the contrary, it's good to include them in your writing and to add them in and figure out where they go. And one of the places you might spot this is the revision process. And, well, why is it good? As with all things we've framed in this discussion, it's good because you are showing that you've really done your research and you're familiar with the whole field, not just the perspectives that agree with you. And it sort of strengthens your argument if you're able to dismiss counter arguments before people have even made them. Okay, so, and then the final thing that the critic might do is identify anything that you've missed. So if there are like gaps in your writing, in your argument, if you're making a leap that doesn't quite make sense, or you've got like a blatant lack of support for something, a critic would probably notice that. Or if you're overgeneralizing, a critic would probably notice that. So reading from that critical perspective can help you identify it, and then you can take these sorts of notes and take off your costumes, go back to your writerly self, and figure out how to insert this stuff into the draft that you write. Okay, so we're going to call all of those sort of like the more macro strategies to approaching the paper toward higher order concerns. And with that in mind, I thought that we could look at a draft and figure out how best to revise it. This is a piece of student writing that I pulled off the internet, surprise, surprise. And apparently this is maybe a college application essay that someone submitted. So I'm going to start the screen share, and then we can talk about maybe how best or what sort of the strategies we've just talked about we would apply to the revising of this. So maybe it's coming up here, I hope. And the first step would probably just be for me to read through this aloud. Okay, I'm going to start with the prompt. Again, this is a college admissions essay. So the prompt was, evaluate a significant experience, achievement, risk you have taken, or ethical dilemma you have faced and its impact on you. And then here is the paper as it's written. One significant experience I had was when I camped out in the wilderness with my dad for 2 weeks last summer. That was a very buggy experience, but more than the leftover scars from branch wounds and brambles are left with me. I think I grew up on that trip. I had never camped before, and now my father thought it would be good for us to bond away from civilization. We packed and headed out, not for a campground with tent sites and shower rooms. We headed for the back regions of swamps and raspberry bushes, at least 1,000 miles from home and regular communication. We actually had to walk into the pond where we would set up our home away from home. What a trek. It was terrible, and when we finally arrived, I was already set to leave. But no, we had to unpack our gear, prepare the ground, put up the tent, and then think about food. That wasn't going to be a quick trip to the fridge or ice cream and soda. We needed a campfire, a place to put our staples so bears wouldn't get into them, and the meal itself, trout. That meant we had to get our fishing gear ready and wade out to the depth, so cold streams and running leeches. Yuck. It was a good 45 minutes later while the sun set and the flies bit that we got our first bites. I was able to get 2 trout, and Dad finished off with 2 more. We gutted them and fried them. Delicious, I must say. It was then we sat and talked over the plans for the next day. Those 2 weeks were difficult. I had to do everything from scratch, even build my own house. I had to carry water, find berries, get wood for the fire, dry out wet clothes from a night of rain, even mend things that broke, like my fishing pole. I learned something about myself. I could survive. I didn't need my cell phone or my TV or my CDs, even my friends and my car to get along. Things might not have been the most luxurious for me out in the backcountry of nowhere, but I was doing pretty well with a full stomach, good sleep, invigorating exercise, and yep, a book, which Dad had insisted I bring along. I also had Dad. He and I had never really talked like we did over those 2 weeks. It's amazing how many things have been left unsaid over the years after he divorced my mom. He told me about how much the divorce hurt, how he being with me in the know, how he felt about Mom and his new wife. He explained it all, and it made some sense. The divorce didn't happen out of nowhere. There had been problems even before I was born, and they didn't hate me or each other. They had good and bad feelings and memories, just like I did. I began to see my dad and my mom, too, through different eyes, and I saw them as people apart from me. That was a revelation, an adult one. That it wasn't all about me, and the things don't stay the same or perfect all the time. When Dad and I left the woods, we were still sweating and the deer flies were still biting, but I felt different. I was stronger, and that strength was something that came not only from knowing how to cook my own food, lug armfuls of wood 3 or 4 times a day, and make my own safe and cozy place in the world, no matter where. It came from an inner sense of seeing things as they are. Life isn't just out of a magazine with the best appliances and the nicest furniture. There are other things in life, like dirty floors and relationships that don't always work, and meals that have to be made. But that's not all bad. Okay, great. So great, I'm coming back. So were there other people here, I would have a discussion about which of the strategies we've discussed might be the most effective or would be the most fun in approaching this paper. One thing that I would maybe suggest, having read it now, is doing an early pass-through. Okay, so if we talked about the stages with which you might approach writing, we can first start by asking, does this complete the assignment? So evaluate a significant experience, achievement, risk you have taken, or ethical dilemma, and its impact. And I think that the author pretty much does this, right? Evaluate a significant experience, right? And describe its impact. That happens over the course of this document. But the next thing I'd maybe look for is the thesis statement. And the thesis statement, for me, is a little bit hard to pick out. I think I have an idea of where it is in this first paragraph. But the author says, I think I grew up on that trip. And for me, that is sort of like the guiding idea of this paper. So it's more of a reflective paper. So the thesis is sort of like a description of the change that happens within the person. But I think I grew up on that trip. Okay, well, that's pretty broad. And I guess, you know, as a reader of this, an outside reader, I would probably ask, well, how did you grow up and why? And though I know some of that is coming, I think in terms of the thesis statement, there's probably a way to deepen a little bit more and orient the reader toward, you know, like what they can expect in the argument to come. So in looking for other places where the thesis kind of shows up here, it seems like the author is trying to say toward the end here that strength, that he accessed strength, which wasn't just from cooking food and lugging armfuls of wood and making a safe and cozy place. It was also from acknowledging that relationships don't always work and that, you know, life has both good and bad to it. But all of that is a part of growing up. So if the author, so one way of revising this paper, if I were the author, I'd probably think about how to kind of like synthesize that or like boil that down into a thesis statement, because I think it's a lot more specific and has a lot more profundity to it perhaps than just like, I grew up. Okay, and tells us, as the prompt is asking us to do, what, not only what the significant experience was, but why, or what impact it had. Okay, so that's one pass-through that might happen. The next thing I'd maybe think about is paragraph organization. So when looking through these paragraphs and kind of like going through and naming the function of them, I'm gonna bring this back up, I guess, so everyone can look at it. Okay. So we've got this kind of like intro paragraph of setting it up. Then we have this paragraph that's about never having camped before in the back regions and being far away from everything. Okay. But it happens to be headed for the back regions of swamps and raspberry bushes. So it's about like getting to the spot a little bit too. And here we start this next one again with also like getting to the spot. We actually had to walk to the pond and setting up, right? And then it goes from there into how extensive of a process it was to cook food, but the food ended up being good, right? Okay. So already it seems like there's some paragraph reorganization to be done. So if it all ends up feeling important to the author that the like getting there and the making of food be included, the author might want to think about regrouping some of the ideas here so that one paragraph is just about how much effort it took to make food, right? And the topic sentence of that would be like, you know, something about the effort it took to make food. And the paragraph before, all this other stuff about we had to walk to the pond, goes with the material about how far in the back regions and in the swamps this camping trip took place. Okay, so some of like the location. So maybe one paragraph would be the location, and maybe one paragraph would be the making of the food, something like that. Then, okay, so we can stop there, but that would be one example of approaching the paragraph restructuring. The other thing that might be worth noting in this like reading for argument is that what seems most significant about this has to do with this person's relationship with their father and how these 2 difficult weeks changed them. So it's striking to me that the first 4 paragraphs kind of all have to do with the setting itself, and only the next, like 2 paragraphs have to do with the transformation that took place through that, or the sort of like deeper stuff. So for me, looking at the balance of the argument, it seems like there's a lot more work that could be done in this sort of like how the hardship was transformative, how the conversations with the dad helped to change. So the idea being, it's not just about having to cook, their own food that should be of interest, right? It's like how that struggle to cook the food, or how that like different way of experiencing the world was a part of the transformation. So in the sort of like analysis part, one could imagine like each paragraph being a different aspect of what was like challenging or different about this camping experience, but not just having the description of it, also having the analysis section that would loop back to the main argument, right? The thesis, which once revised will have something to do with how having to be so autonomous was essential to this person's growing up. Okay. Great. So that would be the strategy of like taking a few passes through the paper and changing some things. Another thing that I did just kind of instinctively when I was reading through it was I had to pause in my reading to try to make sense of what I was reading on sentences that were a little stickier. So here's a good example of that. Gosh, I should have noted it as I was reading, because now I'm having a hard time finding sort of like typos. Okay, so this is something I caught when I was reading. I got to ask him what caused his divorce, how he felt about being with me. No. I realized as I was reading it that it was the word no instead of now, which I think is what the author intended. That's more on the editing side, admittedly, or even the proofreading side, but it's a helpful thing perhaps to note that I kind of like picked it up in my own reading aloud of the document. Okay, let's see. Another fun strategy with this would be to, I'm going to come back, to try reading it in those different characters that we talked about. So maybe if we tried doing a sympathetic character and then a critical character, and doing some passes of the document then. So who might be a sympathetic character? I guess right now I'm thinking someone who might really enjoy reading this essay is this person's father, right? And let's just imagine that his son wrote the essay, and the father is reading it, thinking about what they find compelling, or as someone who is present on that camping trip, what they think best works in the description of it, what they like. Well, the father probably maybe finds it humorous that the author describes leftover scars from branch wounds and brambles, maybe appreciates the details of it taking 45 minutes to get a bite for the fish, and that the kid had to repair his own fishing pole. Maybe some of those like details for like setting the scene are going to be compelling to the dad because he remembers some of those things. And he probably appreciates that his son was able to reflect on the divorce and why it happened, and internalize some of the things that were said, and that the greater bonding happened. So maybe the dad would have stuff to praise about the detail of the piece and sort of its reflective quality. And would find compelling as like rhetorical devices some of the humor put into the piece. It's sort of like, yuck, there were leeches in the water, that kind of thing. If, however, this person, we could read it from the imagined audience or from the audience of the college admissions person, who we could call that the critical person. in reading this, they might from the outset have a few questions like, okay, you said one experience you had was when you camped out in the wilderness. Why was that significant? Or you say you grew up, but what does it mean to grow up? How were you before? How were you after? That seems too vague. What does growing up mean? Or I thought that this was a trip about how hard camping was. Why does it matter that you gutted the fish and they were delicious? Or I thought this was a whole 2-week trip and was about how you changed. Why is it an important detail for me to know that you sat and talked over plans for the next day after arriving? You didn't tell me what those plans were. What were they? What were those plans? Well, as the college admissions essay, as the college admissions person, I find it a little bit suspect that your dad had to insist that you bring a book along. I don't know that that's as funny as a different reader might find it to me, who hopes that you will be a scholar when you come into my college. Okay, you say you also had dad, but I don't really know anything about dad. He tells you how much you tell me again that you had a revelation or an adult revelation, but what does it mean to have an adult revelation? Okay, so these sorts of questions are places where the writer might want to deepen based on what the critic persona has to say in reading this piece. Okay, and a final strategy, which we're not going to employ here, but would be a fun one to like have the writer read this aloud to a friend and say, what did you get from it? What really stuck out? Or ask questions of that writer. I mean, of the friend who's reading it. Ask them, what did you take away? You know, like, did it seem like I talked about this too much? Or what did you want to hear more about? It's a good question. Those kind of things are stuff the writer could also do in sharing it. All right, so we're close to finishing now, but I would like to leave by talking about, I guess, what some more sentence level revision strategies are once you've done all this stuff and once you've got your paragraphs reorganized and the whole argument makes sense and your thesis is strong and you've worked internally to make sure the flow, the like ordering of the sentences makes sense within the paragraphs, and then you are ready to revise on the sentence level. Well, okay, this is a lot of the stuff we've covered in the last few weeks, but by way of reviewing them, great to like look sentence to sentence and ask yourself for each sentence to sentence link, is the relationship of these two sentences clear? And if it's not, consider adding a transition or using one of those like lexical cohesion devices we talked about, you know, like a repeating of a pronoun or a partial repetition of some of the words, or using a synonym to link one sentence to the next. Okay, another thing to do, use forceful verbs. This is like, instead of saying he said, she said, like he exclaimed, she mumbled a retort. Stuff that helps the reader get a more vivid picture of what's going on. And since so much of like the vividness is caught up in action, great place to start by trying to do that is the verbs. Look for repetition that you don't intend. So if you find that you said the same word sentence to sentence, might want to change one of those to a synonym, to a different word. And a great way to catch that again is by reading aloud, because you're more likely to hear, like, I thought I just said that word. Oh, I did in this sentence before. Okay, this is a nice one. Cut as many prepositional phrases as you can. So I get this sentence from the University of North Carolina website. You could say there are several examples of the issue of integrity in Huck Finn. So we've got of, in, and it sort of just like starts to make the sentence more and more unwieldy. But a more direct sentence would be something like, Huck Finn repeatedly addresses the issue of integrity. Okay, so you're making the sentence more active. You're cutting out some of those some of those prepositional phrases. Okay, check for sentence variety. So do all of your sentences begin the same way? If it's the blank did this, the blank did that, the blank did that, you might want to change it up a little bit or combine some of them. If you're a visual learner, you could employ the same trick here of like highlighting sentences or like underlining them with different colored pencils. So you could just underline one entire sentence until the period, switch colors, underline different sentence until the next period, switch colors, right? And if you can see that you've got like a healthy variety of sentence lengths visually, so like short one here, and then this one takes up a few lines, and then this one takes up a little bit, that seems good because it means that you're varying the length and structure of your sentences most likely, or like the complexity of them. But if each sentence is like roughly the same line, it could be a sign to you that you want to like try some different strategies for changing it up, as it were. And then finally, a nice question to ask is like, is every sentence the best version of itself or the clearest it could be? And this is just like, as we began with, making your writing as much of a finished product as you possibly can, like really getting your ideas across. So on the sentence level, is this the word I mean? Have I said this in the clearest way? And if not, how better could you say it? Okay. We're going to call that today's workshop on revision strategies. Likely some of these techniques are going to work better for you than others. It's a little bit about finding your own way and finding whatever tactics are most helpful for you in like approaching your own paper with some criticality, but also with some patience toward yourself. And not being afraid to like really rethink what you've already done. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week will be our last workshop, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.